Hello, this is Kelly Reed, pastor of Restoration Fellowship, which meets in Morristown, Tennessee, given space graciously by First Baptist Church there. But we are a Messianic Hebraic fellowship that meets on Saturdays at 1 o'clock. We'd love to have you come by and visit us sometime and get our meeting times and dates at www.restorationmessiah.com. And we started this week in the Torah portions in the book of Leviticus, which is Vayikra, which means and he called. You know, the Lord, he calls to his people and invites them to come into his presence. And that's by itself, that is an amazing concept, to think that the God of the universe, the King of all kings, truly wants his people to come before him. Because so much, they had just gotten the Mishkan, the tabernacle, set up in the wilderness. Now that they've got everything in place, now that they've got all the furnishings, all the curtains, everything, the tabernacle is now echad, it's now one. The book of Leviticus continues on in that account into this is how you are to approach a holy God. This is how you come into the presence of the King of Kings. Because the Ark of the Covenant with the atonement seat, the mercy seat on top is essentially representing God's throne and his reign and rule on earth. And so Leviticus goes into all the different types of sacrifices, because there is a certain protocol in order to allow sinful people like us into the presence of holy God. Those different types of offerings that allow him to come into his presence. And we can't just make up our own rules. We can't just do it our own way and what we think is best and what is right. The king is the one who lays down the rules, the security, so to speak. If you want to come into my presence, this is the manner, this is the way, this is what you must do. Because the great thing about it is the king actually does want his people in his presence. He does want his people to come there to present their case, to present their situations, to hear their requests. He wants us to come into his presence, but there is a right way and a wrong way to do it. And Leviticus 1 opens up. It says, "Now Adonai called to Moses and spoke to him out of the tent of meeting, saying, Speak to Bnei Israel, speak to the children of Israel, and tell them, when any one of you brings an offering to Adonai, you must present your offering of livestock from the herd or from the flock." Notice it says, when any one of you brings an offering. So it's making that statement, it's assuming, it's anticipating people are going to want to come. And when you come, you bring an offering. Chapter 2 opens up the same way. When anyone brings a sacrifice offering of grain to Adonai, his offering shall be of fine flour, and he is to pour oil on it and put frankincense on it. Now these are not mandatory things. These are free will types of things. These are willingness types of things. This is, if you want to be in relationship with me, if you want to be in my presence, then you will come before me. But as the scripture says, we don't come empty-handed. So what that tells me is, even when the king wants you to come, even when you have an invitation, you'd still better be careful about how you approach a holy God. You'd still better obey the protocols. If you dare to approach God apart from the system that he has set up, if you try to approach in your own way, you are really risking your life in order to do it. Because the holiness of God cannot stand sin in his presence. And these offerings, these things, make a way for his people, for us, to be there with him. So not following these procedures properly is one of the main reasons why the Israelites went into exile in the first place. This refusal to obey and to follow the protocols led to consequences. Refusal to keep the commandments, refusal to keep the Sabbath, refusal to keep the feasts. As an example, the exile lasted for 70 years. And that 70 represents, how the Israelites did not allow the land to rest every year, every 7 years in the Shemitah cycle. So for the 490 years they were in charge, this 70 represents that time they were supposed to allow it to rest. So again, coming into the presence of the king, even with his invitation, requires doing it a certain way. And so much of the plan and purpose of God, when he is demonstrating and showing the redemption of humanity, plays out this reality. It's really what makes the statement in Hebrews so powerful and amazing in terms of the hope and the promise that we have in Messiah. Hebrews chapter 4 verse 16 says, "Therefore let us draw near to the throne of grace with boldness," with something that had not existed in the system before. There was always a trepidation, there was always a fear, but because of the work of Messiah, we are able to approach his throne with boldness. So that it goes on to say, so that we may receive mercy and find grace for help in our time of need. Going before the king with all of our prayers, with all of our requests, we make these things known to God. And he is willing to hear. But that notion of being able to go into his presence with boldness, with courage, with assurance of relationship and love is all the difference that Messiah makes. Because before as the book of Hebrews talks about, the sacrifices were never for salvation. And they could not cleanse the conscience of the worshiper. They could not take away the sin problem, and they just had to be done over and over and over again. But Messiah came and gave his life, covered and atoned for our sin once and for all. And so because of that, we are able to go into his presence, go into the throne of grace with boldness. Now here's the thing, try coming into the presence of the king without an invitation and expect to be tackled like the Secret Service would do if you try to run and jump the fence at the White House, which has happened in the last few years. You expect to be not treated very nicely by security. You're going to get tackled, you're going to get tased, you're going to have the dogs thrown at running at you. You're going to be thrown out, essentially, because you are not authorized to just walk up whenever you want to. And when you think about the parables and the stories that Yeshua tells in the New Testament, when the king comes, when the host of the wedding banquet comes and finds someone who is not wearing the wedding clothes that he has provided, well, that person gets thrown out to a place where there is weeping and gnashing of teeth. It's not as if the king or the master of the ceremony did not provide those things for you, did not make a way for you. You just refused and tried to do it some other way, and so you are not welcome at his table. So how much fear must there be when you don't know? This is just something to consider. The significance of that Hebrews passage. How much fear must there be when you don't know whether the king that you approach is actually merciful? How much fear must there be if you don't really know whether the king wants you to be there at all? When you can't say for sure whether the king even knows who you are or cares about you or much less loves you. That kind of uncertainty is not a part of the life of the believer in Messiah. That's why we can approach with grace, his throne of grace, with boldness. But here's the thing, what about coming without the king's invitation? If you try coming into the presence of the king without his invitation, that requires a special special dispensation of his mercy and pardon. That's actually the kind of fear and uncertainty that exists in the book of Esther, which leads up to the festival of Purim, which is happening this week on the calendar. See, even though in that story, in that book of Esther, even though the king was Esther's husband, she did not know for sure what kind of reception she would receive, because while she was her husband, he was also her king. And she didn't know what kind of reception she would receive because she was breaking protocol to go before him, and she knew it. That's what she says in Esther chapter 4, verse 11. She says, all the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces fully understand that for anyone, man or woman, who approaches the king in the inner courtyard without being summoned, without following that protocol, without being invited, he has one law, that he is to be put to death, unless the king extends his golden scepter, permitting him to live. See, coming without invitation is dangerous, and refusing an invitation is dangerous. That's what Vashti did. She refused to come at the king's call and the king's command, and she suffered the consequences for it. Now here is Esther. She is doing the opposite. She's coming without an invitation, and she's risking her life by going before the king unsummoned and breaking this procedure, breaking this protocol. And yet, as the scripture says, that she found favor in the eyes of the king. And that word favor is the Hebrew word chen, which is really better translated the idea of grace. See, that's one of those hidden things that we sometimes lose and sometimes forget. We seem to think that grace is just a New Testament concept, and it's not. It's always been there. Sometimes our translations hide it by using a word like favor, but the real concept, the real idea is that of grace, unmerited, undeserved favor. She found grace in the eyes of the king. Now, isn't that what we are looking for from our king? Isn't that what we want? Now, see, when you look at the book of Esther, it's believed that Malachi and Nehemiah, those two books were written in the 430s time period BC. And more than likely the writers of these books were contemporaries of Esther, because it was probably written in sometime between 460 and 430 BC. Xerxes' son Artaxerxes ruled from 465 to 424. And what's amazing about him, when you look at what his Greek name is, Xerxes, in the scriptures, he is called Ahasuerus or Achashvarosh. And that word there, the ending of that word in Hebrew, Achashvarosh, the Rosh means head or chief. And the closest thing that I could find in looking at the beginning of that word, the Achash, is the Persian term for the satrap. So he is essentially, the title of it is that he is the head or the chief satrap, which is very similar to the idea of the king of the kings. So he is claiming a title like unto that, and in many ways his character plays out as the role of the bridegroom in here. Because in the book of Esther, the scene between the three major characters, the scene of judgment and salvation, is on display. It takes place here in this book because all three major characters are present. You have the king, Xerxes, you have the bride, who is Esther, and then you have the accuser, which is Haman. He is the accuser of the bride, or the accuser of the people of God. And the accuser's goal throughout history he's had the same tactic from the very beginning, which is to destroy the people of God, destroy the bride. And I call him the accuser because that's really what Satan means. Hasatan, it means the accuser. So this has been his tactic all along. Just after the fall and the expulsion from the garden, the accuser essentially is trying to create his own people to attack and kill the people of God, those who are still going after, seeking after, and calling upon the name of the Lord, the godly line of Seth. And when you read in Genesis 4:22 about Tubal-Cain making these bronze and iron tools, most often those are translated and considered like farming utensils and instruments, but they literally means it's things that cut, and they assume it's talking about the soil. But things that cut made of bronze and iron, especially in that culture, were not just farming instruments, they were most often typically weapons. Weapons used against other people, and particularly the people of God. And by the end of the chapter, there's that passage where it talks about at that time people began to call upon the name of the Lord. And I've always assumed, and many of you may have as well, that that was a favorable thing, that that was a good thing, that at the end of that chapter, that people were beginning to try to return and come back in relationship with the Lord. But one of the words that's in Hebrew that's not directly translated into English is actually the opposite of calling upon the Lord in a favorable way. It's actually more of a curse and a blaspheming of the name of the Lord. So when it says it's began to call upon the name of the Lord, these are people that are actually coming against the Lord and speaking evil against Him and of Him and anyone who associates with Him. To where the point that the culture, the society of human beings is not getting better. If they were truly calling upon the name of the Lord, you would think that they as the people would be getting better and better and better, but that's not what we find. They're getting worse and worse and worse, to the point that by the time of Noah, the majority of the population that was left is against God, is evil. Their thoughts are on evil all the time, and they were against God, and they were essentially children of the accuser. And they were so numerous that they outnumbered the people of God. They were like the sands of the sea. And Noah and his family were some of the only ones left. To where Noah was the only one in that generation who was blameless before God. But God reversed the situation in the flood, and He started the process of reviving His people, the descendants of Abraham, to where they were going to number. They were promised to number as the stars in the sky and the sand in the sea. But again, what does the enemy do? When Egypt comes, when they are down there in Egypt, again, the people of the bride, the people of God, were targeted with the killing of the male children. They were essentially trying to wipe them out. But the more that Egypt tried to wipe them out, the more they multiplied. And then you come to the periods of the judgments, the periods of the exiles. And here in the book of Esther, the accuser tries again to destroy the people of God, both there in Persia and even extended all the way over into the land of Israel. He was going to destroy the people of God in every province of the kingdom of Persia. And the accuser, through Haman the Agagite, in the end, the accuser failed. And then when you go even further forward into the future, into the day of the Lord, into the return, in the days in the books of Revelation, in the book of Revelation and such, the accuser is going to again try to make his own people, to where they can make war against the people of God, to rival the descendants of Abraham and make war against them. That's Revelation chapter 20, verse 7. It says, when the 1,000 years had ended, Satan, the accuser, shall be released from his prison, and he shall come out to deceive the nations at the four corners of the earth, Gog and Magog, to gather them for battle. And their number, the number of the accuser's people, will be like the sand of the sea. And they came up on the broad plain of the earth, and surrounded the camp of the Kedoshim, the holy ones, and the beloved city, which is referring to Jerusalem. And so that's what the accuser has always been trying to do. He's been trying to make his own people. He's been trying to wipe out the people of God. And here we have this playing out. You have the king or the bridegroom with his bride and the accuser. And the bride has come before the bridegroom in broken protocol. She's come without invitation. She's come without permission. And the only way her life will be spared is if there is an extension of grace. The extension of the scepter of the king, where he is extending himself down to her level, descending from his high and lofty throne and coming down to where she is, that she might be saved. He is coming down and descending to where she is, where the bride is, where the one who is accused is. And so it is an extension of grace and mercy, but it's also in it is that invitation, because the king really does want her to be there. See, this protection, this covering extended to her by the king is extended not just to Esther, the one woman, but as we see in this story, it's extended to all of her people. It's extended to the bride and her people as a whole. And in the end, it's the accuser, it's Haman and his people are the only ones that are judged. It's not the bride. It's not the one who's been accused. It's Haman. It's the accuser. It's the enemy himself. Look at Esther chapter 7, verse 9. It says, Harbona, one of the eunuchs attending the king, said, Look, a gallows 50 cubits high is standing next to Haman's house. Haman himself made it for Mordecai, who spoke good on behalf of the king. And so the king said, hang Haman on it. And so they hanged Haman on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai. And so this whole account gives an explanation for why there is the festival time, why there is the celebration of Purim, the casting of the lots. Esther chapter 9 verse 1 says, Consequently on the 13th day of the 12th month, that is the month of Adar, the king's edict and his law drew near to be carried out, and on that day the enemies of the Jews had hoped to overpower them. But contrary to expectations, the Jews gained the upper hand over those that hated them. And Jews assembled in their cities throughout all the provinces of King Ahasuerus in order to lay hands on those seeking their harm. No one was able to stand against them, for the fear of them had fallen on all peoples. So again, the king was able to reverse the situation, reverse the plan of the accuser and the enemy, and save his people instead. And so when the accuser tries to kill off the people of God, kill off the bride, God turns it around and thwarts him instead. And again, we see that in Revelation 20, the second part of verse 9. In talking about it, it says, their number is like the sand of the sea. And it says, and they came up on the broad plain of the earth, surrounded the camp of the Kedoshim, of the beloved city, but fire fell from heaven and consumed them. And the devil who deceived them was thrown into the lake of fire and brimstone, where the beast and the false prophet are too, and they shall be tortured day and night forever and ever. So in this effort to destroy the bride, destroy the people of God, through this persecution here in the book of Esther, for example, actually accomplishes the opposite. It is actually the means of his defeat. The accuser is not able to overcome the plans and the purposes of God. And so while he sought to destroy the people of God, he himself is destroyed. Because this effort to destroy the bride works the opposite. And the Father, what we see in this invitation, in this saving of his bride, he actually wants to increase his bride, not decrease them. That's what you see in Esther chapter 8. This is the key to understanding the book of Esther. It's the key to understanding the heart of God, where it talks about how he doesn't want anyone to perish, but all to come to repentance. It says in Esther chapter 8 verse 16, he says, For the Jews there was light and gladness, joy and honor. Throughout every province and throughout every city, wherever the king's edict and his law went, the Jews had gladness and joy, banquets and holidays. And here's the key line. It says, Many peoples of the land became Jews because the fear of the Jews had overcome them. Many people. So here they have all these different ethnicities, all these different backgrounds existing within the kingdom, and they saw the favor of the king upon the Jewish people. They saw the fear, and they understood the fear of the God who saved them. That's really what it means when the fear of the Jews. That's talking about God. But many peoples of the land became Jews. They wanted to be a part of that. They wanted to be under that protection. They wanted to be under that grace and that invitation. And so rather than decreasing and destroying and wiping out the people of God, these efforts actually worked to increase them. So by any means necessary, the Father is willing to increase His people. And sometimes He increases His people through hardship. Sometimes He increases them through persecution. In the midst of Egypt, with all the bad things that were going on to them in slavery down there, they multiplied. And here in the book of Esther, with all the bad things going against them, many people became Jews because of all of this. So persecution brought growth in Esther's day. Persecution often brings growth in other times, in other moments throughout history, the history of the people of God. It chases off those who aren't taking the faith very seriously. And so those that remain, they can't stop talking about Him. They show a light and a love for the Lord that other times it becomes complacent. So persecution actually works to increase the people of God because we are strengthened. And persecution will even strengthen the people of God in the book of Revelation. And so I say all of this is, Leviticus is laying down the protocols for coming into the tabernacle and later the future temple. And so if you want to approach Him, this is the way to do it. And of course, all of those sacrifices, all of those offerings are shadows and types and pictures of what Messiah does for us. As the free will offering, as the peace offering, as the sin offering, as so many different pictures that Messiah fulfills in that. But we also know that none of us are going to ever be able to keep all of those protocols perfectly, because all have sinned and all of us have fallen short of the glory of God. And so, even though we break protocol in wanting to come before the King, we also, like Esther, need to receive grace. Because of our sin, we've broken that protocol in our efforts to come before the King. And even if we did everything right, even if we did all the ritual and protocol done correctly, it's what's in here, it's our heart that hasn't been changed. It's still corrupt. We need the King. We need the bridegroom to descend to where we are and stand in our place, extend His grace to cover our sin and protect us from the efforts of the accuser to destroy us. And thankfully, we have such a King. We have such a Messiah, Yeshua HaMashiach, our Savior, our salvation. He is the one who came to the earth, came born of a virgin, lived that perfect life, offered Himself as a sinless, perfect sacrifice in our place. We have such a King who gave His life for us, even though we didn't deserve it. And I pray that you know that King, that you have called upon the name of Yeshua HaMashiach, Jesus the Messiah, that you have called upon Him because the King actually wants you to come before Him. And I pray as you go and you study, maybe hopefully you'll go back and study the book of Esther, and you'll see once again the power of the redemption story that's there even in that story, because it's always been about His grace. Even in the Old Testament, His grace is all over it. And so I just invite you to see the hand of God extending His mercy and His grace to us. We just need to take hold of it and receive it. And that is the great blessing. And I pray that you will be blessed as you study these books, and we'd invite you to come and visit us sometime on a Saturday, on a Sabbath day at 1 o'clock over in Morristown. Come find us again at our website's www.restorationmessiah.com. We would love to have you come and visit us